Welcome to the League of Women Voters Prop Talk Ballot Review. I'm Lori Thiel, President of the League of Women Voters of San Diego. The League was founded 100 years ago this year to support women who had earned the right to vote through the ratification of the 19th Amendment. We are and have always been a nonpartisan organization, which means we have never supported or opposed any political candidate or party. We conduct education and advocacy, and today's event is an education program. It is an unbiased review of the 12 California propositions and the 5 San Diego ballot measures. I will be presenting today along with my co-presenter, Jennifer Avena. But before we get started, I'd like to take just a moment to discuss voting and your ballot. You'll discover through this presentation that the ballots this year are very dense and complicated, and you may need to access multiple resources beyond this presentation to feel fully informed. So for additional information, I invite you to visit our website, lwvsandiego.org. But if after studying your ballot, you don't feel informed or interested about a particular issue, just skip that question. In other words, you don't have to vote on everything, but you do have to vote. Okay, so let's talk about our ballots. This year, all registered active voters in California will receive a ballot in the mail. You don't have to request it. It'll be automatically sent to you. Furthermore, you can track that ballot by signing up at where'smyballot.sos.gov. During the election season, there will be 126 secure Dropbox locations across San Diego to use. And in the 4 days of in-person voting, which lasts from Halloween, October 31st, to Election Day, November 3rd, there will be 235 polling locations. You can find that information for yourself on the back of your ballot when it's mailed to you, or you can go to the county registrar's website. It's sdvote.com, and you can look up that information on their site. Oh, I also want to remind you, you can, of course, vote by mail. It's an easy, safe, and secure way to vote. The USPS has been working with the Registrar of Voters here in San Diego County to ensure a safe and secure handling of your ballot. So just pop it in the mail, no extra postage required. Okay, now on to the propositions. In California, these propositions do one of 3 things. They make new laws, they change existing laws, or they change California's constitution. They're put on your ballot by 2 methods. One is either citizens initiative, which is signature gathering, or legislative referrals, which means our legislators have put them on a ballot for us. Each of the propositions we're going to review with you today require a simple majority to pass, which is 50% plus 1 yes vote.
You can see here, this is the list of them, and interestingly, these numbers aren't necessarily relevant. They're just assigned as the propositions come in. So what we've decided to do for you today is to categorize them so that the information we're sharing today will make a little bit more sense to you. So we've grouped these 15 propositions in 3 categories. The first is taxes and rent control, and those will be propositions 15, 19, and 21. The next will be criminal justice and civil rights. Those will be propositions 16, 17, 18, 20, and 25. And then the rest of them we'll just put in a miscellaneous category at the end. It'll be props 14, 22, 23, and 24. So with that, I will introduce Jenny Avena. She will discuss the first proposition, Prop 15.
Thanks, Lori. Well, welcome everybody. We're so happy to have you here this morning. And like Lori said, we're going to start out with taxes and rent control. If you're following along at home on your handy dandy little sheet, we'll be doing 15, 19, and 21. So go ahead and advance the slide. Because 2 of our propositions deal with property taxes, and because understanding property taxes in California is so important to understanding many other issues, I thought we'd briefly go over some basic info on that. All properties subject to property taxes in California and in most other places across the US, property taxes are based on the value of your property. The tax assessor comes up with a value. Sometimes it's close to market value and sometimes not. But then the property taxes are set as a percentage of that value. So we have a very unrealistic example here of a $1,000 property with a 10% tax rate. That owner would pay $100 for their annual property taxes. And then if the value of the property went up to $2,000 the next year, the owner would pay $200 and so on. So the point is that as the value of your property goes up, so do your property taxes. But of course, in California, we have another twist, as we always do. In 1978, California voters passed Proposition 13, which capped those property tax rates. And this was because at the time, property values were increasing very rapidly, and property owners were seeing some steep increases in their property taxes, sometimes in the magnitude of up to 100% increase in just 1 year. So that was really difficult for many people to afford, and there was a fear that people might lose their houses because they couldn't afford to pay their property taxes. Prop 13 passed and put a cap on those taxes, but I want you to keep in mind that Prop 13 applies to all properties in California, not just residential properties, but industrial, commercial, and agricultural as well. And the rule for all of those properties today is that your property taxes are set at 1% of the fair market value of the property in the year that you purchase it. Then those property taxes cannot go up more than 2% each year, no matter how much the value of your property goes up, as long as you still own the property. If someone sells the property, then the property tax value is reset back to the fair market value of the property for the new owner. And the whole process starts again at 1% and only being able to be raised 2% each year. So there are some local bond measures that can add more to your property taxes on top of that 2%, but that's more detail than we need for right now. So with that background, let's move on to our first proposition related to property taxes. But Prop 15 is a proposition that will increase funding sources for public schools, community colleges, and local government services by changing the tax assessment of commercial and industrial property. So just commercial and industrial properties are affected by Prop 15. The current situation is that taxes are based on commercial and industrial property. Taxes based on commercial and industrial property are a major source of funding for counties, cities, schools, and special districts. So we just noted that all properties in California are reassessed back to fair market value when those properties are sold or transferred to a new owner. Because most property is not sold every year, and because property in California tends to rise in value more than 2% each year, most properties of all types hold an assessed value of less than the actual fair market value for tax purposes. But this is particularly true of commercial and industrial properties because these types of properties tend to transfer ownership less often. Those 1% property taxes from all properties go to counties to be distributed to local governments and school districts. After Prop 13 was passed in 1978, however, the total amount of the property tax revenues declined and the state's general fund became the primary funder of California schools. So what Prop 15 would do if passed is that it would generally require that commercial and industrial properties be reassessed to market value on a periodic basis. So instead of the property taxes rising only 2% per year, as long as the property doesn't change ownership, the commercial and industrial properties would be reassessed starting in tax year 2022, and then reassessed to market value at least every 3 years after that, regardless of whether there was a change in ownership. Prop 15 would only change the way that commercial and industrial property is assessed. It would make no changes to any residential properties or to agricultural properties, and it doesn't matter if the residential property is occupied by the owner or rented out to others. Prop 15 would also not affect a commercial or industrial property owner if the value of all of the property that they held in California was less than $3 million. Then there would be no reassessment until sold, just like residential and agricultural properties. The 1% tax assessment rate would remain the same on all properties. It would just be that commercial and industrial properties would be reassessed at least every 3 years back to market value. So that's the big change with Prop 15. There are some other provisions for a small business, and a small business is defined as having 50 or fewer employees, being independently owned and operated, and having property in California. So a small business would be completely exempt from personal property taxes, sometimes called business equipment and fixtures taxes. And then any business, no matter what size or how many employees, would have their first $500,000 of personal property exempt from taxes. So the fiscal effect of this would be that it's estimated that Prop 15 would produce about $6.5 to $11.5 billion per year in additional property tax revenue for local services. Of that amount, about 60% would be distributed to local governments, so $4 to $7 billion, and 40% would go to schools and community colleges, about $2.5 to $4.5 billion annually. Property taxes on business equipment would be reduced by several hundred millions of dollars each year. The cost to the state would be several $100 million to start, because the state would at first pay for the costs of carrying out the measure. And then as revenue to counties increase, those counties would then pay the money back to the state. Okay, so supporters say that Prop 15 is a fair and balanced reform that closes property tax loopholes, benefiting wealthy corporations while giving tax breaks to small businesses to help our economy grow. It provides billions in new revenue for our communities and schools. It requires full transparency in how the money is spent. And then 10% of the wealthiest businesses would provide more than 90% of the revenue. It keeps Prop 13's protections for homeowners, renters, and farms. And I'm not going to go over who all the supporters are, but I will mention if our league or one of our leagues is an official supporter. So here, the League of Women Voters of California is an official signer of the argument in support. So opponents say Prop 15 would trigger the largest property tax increase in California's history. Additional costs would ultimately raise prices for consumers. It'll be harder for people to start small businesses, and it will require a huge cost to administer. So next slide is just a wrap up that's going to tell you, to recap, yes means you're voting for property taxes to change on commercial and industrial properties to be reassessed at least every 3 years, and a no means things would stay the same. Commercial and industrial properties would be treated the same as other properties.
I'm going to take us to our next proposition, our next prop review. This too is related to what Jenny was discussing regarding taxes and real estate. This in particular relates to Prop 13 as well. So, and it refers to the tax assessment transfers and inheritance rules that were set up years ago. So the current situation is, as we all know from 1978, homeowners and special groups can move their property taxes with them when they sell their home and move into a home of equal or lesser value. So that special group includes people over 55, people who have some disability, and people who have experienced some natural disaster. Those inheritance property tax rules allow transfers to heirs as well. So in addition to the subgroup that I mentioned earlier, when a person transfers their home to their heir, they can keep the same taxable value with no reassessment. So as you can see, the California Association of Realtors launched a campaign in 2019. You all may remember Prop 5, and that failed. So this is another additional discussion about that. So next slide. So what Prop 19 would do, it would allow those eligible homeowners that we discussed earlier to transfer that property's taxable value to not only a home of equal or lesser value, but with this prop, it would allow them to transfer it to a more expensive home, and they could do it up to 3 times versus just once in a lifetime, as the previous law required. It would still allow the once in a lifetime transfer for victims of wildfire, but the up to 3 times would only allow the people who are 55 or older, or the people who qualify for the disabled category to do it up to 3 times. And importantly, what Prop 19 would also do is it would eliminate the transfer of taxable values of inherited properties. So currently, when a property is inherited, that the individual who receives that property can do whatever he or she wants with it. But this proposition would require that that person, in order to keep that transferred of taxable value, they'd have to live in that residence or farm. So it would also use increased state revenue from Prop 19 for wildfire suppression. So those are the major portions of Prop 19 that are affecting this, Prop 13. So here's the fiscal bottom line. There could be some revenue lost from the transfer of home ownership that's going to be offset and increased. There will be local governments that will get millions of dollars per year because this loophole is closed with the inheritance property assessment. It can increase home sales. It can increase state administrative costs. And then, of course, any of those savings would be applied to suppression efforts for fires. You know, they say that this proposition expands Prop 13's rules for homeowners who are seniors and wildfire victims and people with disabilities. They also claim that it closes the loophole on inherited properties. And here you can see are some of the supporters of this particular proposition. And here's the total money raised as of last month to support this particular proposition. Next slide is this slide that discusses the opponents and their arguments. So people who oppose this, they discuss the fact that the reassessment to market value will force families to sell their properties. They believe that the right of families to pass their homes and their property as up to $1 million in taxes shouldn't be changed because they think Prop 13 is accurate as it is. And then here is the list of organizations and people who oppose this particular proposition. And there at the end, you can see the money raised in opposition to Prop 19. Okay, so next slide, it just is our wrap up. It tells you what Prop 19 does and doesn't do. If you vote yes, it means that the changes and the specific subgroups will be affected by Prop 19, and a no vote means that essentially the tax and the inheritance valuation will stay as it is.
So we're moving on to Proposition 21, and this proposition expands local government's authority to enact rent control on residential property. So the last one dealt with commercial and industrial property, the one that I talked about, and then this one deals with residential property about rent control. Okay, so the current situation is in 1995, California legislators passed the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, which prohibited rent control of single-family homes or of any housing built after 1995. Since then, California's housing shortage for both purchase and for rent has become more extreme. California has 6 of the nation's 11 most expensive rental markets, and of course, San Diego is one of them. A third of California renters spend more than 50% of their income on rent. On the November 2018 ballot, there was a proposition to repeal Costa-Hawkins, so this might look familiar. That proposition was defeated. And then in January of 2020, the state legislature passed AB 1482, which limited the amount that a landlord could raise rent each year to 5% plus the local inflation rate. AB 1482 also requires landlords to show just cause for termination of a lease. Rentals built in the last 15 years are exempt, as are condos and single-family homes, unless they're owned by a corporation or a real estate investment trust. And that was AB 1482 was a statewide measure. If passed, Prop 21 would amend the Costa-Hawkins Act so that rent control could apply to all properties that are more than 15 years old, including single-family homes. There is an exemption for landlords that own only their own home and one other home as a rental, but they must hold title to the rental property as a natural person. They couldn't hold it as an LLC or a corporation in order to be exempt from those possible rent control measures. Prop 21 would also allow cities to limit increases in rental rates after a unit is vacated, and that's called vacancy control. Vacancy control is a provision of rent control that limits how much a landlord can raise rent after a unit is vacated. Landlords would be able to increase rents up to 15% if a renter moves out within the first 3 years of living in a rental. So just to be clear, passage of Prop 21 would not bring rent control to anywhere in the state that doesn't already have it. Instead, it would remove some of the restrictions so that local jurisdictions could choose whether or not to enact rent control and what it would look like if they did in their own cities. Go ahead. The fiscal impact of this would be if communities do respond to passage of 21 by expanding rent control, then the most likely effects are that some landlords would sell their rental properties, the value of rental housing would decline, some renters would spend less on rent, some landlords would receive less rental income, and some renters would move less often due to less rent increases. There would also be increased government costs for communities that enacted rent control because local rent boards would have to be created, or it would increase their workload. But those fees would likely be paid by owners of rental housing. Go ahead. All right, so supporters say that homelessness is a serious and growing problem, and that small increases in rent can force more families into homelessness, which is a burden on the entire community. And the high cost of housing in California leaves many seniors and veterans with too few resources for necessities. Prop 21 guarantees landlords a fair rate of return, and it allows local communities to limit their rent increases and preserve affordable housing. Go ahead. Opponents say that more than 60% of California voters rejected a nearly identical proposal in 2018, and rent control results in less available and less affordable housing. Prop 21 would reduce the number of new housing units built, cost jobs, and hurt the economic recovery. And there was a nonpartisan analysis that estimated that if Prop 21 passes, housing values could be reduced by up to 20%. So to recap, if you vote yes on this, that means that Costa-Hawkins would be repealed, the law at the state level, and it would simply allow local jurisdictions to have the choice to enact rent control if they desired to do that. A no means that state law would remain and Costa-Hawkins would be enacted. Local jurisdictions couldn't choose to expand rent control.
All right, here we are. We're at the next cluster that Jenny and I have put in categories for us all so that we can maybe make better sense of these propositions. This category, as you can see, is criminal justice and civil rights. And so we'll start with the first proposition in that category. It is Prop 16. So as you can see, Prop 16 allows diversity as a factor in public employment, education, and contracting decisions. So as you all know, the 14th Amendment ensures equal protection under the law. But in 1996, California approved Proposition 209, which is considered by some people even more restrictive than federal law in banning affirmative action. So the way it is now, municipalities cannot consider race, sex, color, ethnicity, or country of origin in making decisions for hiring purposes or anything that has to do with state or municipal decision making. So public entities in California have had opportunities to encourage people who are perhaps unrepresented in employment and other programs to provide information about their background in order to make their hiring a little bit more diverse. But because of Prop 209, that has been greatly hampered in California. So next slide. So what Prop 16 would do is repeal that section of Prop 209 that is so restrictive. So it would eliminate that ban on considering race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in public education, public employment, and public contracting. So it would loosen the restrictions that California put on itself in relation to affirmative action. So it would allow the state and local entities to establish a wider range of policies and programs to hire and make decisions as it relates to people who are perhaps underrepresented in our communities. All right, next slide. So the fiscal bottom line, some of these propositions, as you will discover as we go forward, don't necessarily have a vast influence on or effect on the bottom line fiscally. So we will provide information like you see here with bullet points that give you some idea about how it might be affected. But the specific decisions are unknown because this proposition would just allow municipalities a wider latitude, and whether or not they take it and how they take it is hard to anticipate. Okay, next slide. The supporters and their arguments. So supporters say that 16 would allow equal opportunity for all Californians, and it would make it a more diverse state and make the hiring apparatus more reflective of our diverse state and nation. And you can see here the supporters, the list here, which includes the League of Women Voters of California, as well as several other organizations and people. And there's the money raised to support this proposition. Okay, next slide. Opponents, people who oppose this believe that 209 was fair and it's a piece of legislation that should stay intact. Their argument is that this Prop 19 perpetuates stereotypes of minorities and women. And some of the opponents include the UC Board of Regents member, Ward Connerly. So these are particular organizations and individuals who have contributed to the opposition of this proposition. And here you can see the amount of money raised to oppose this prop. So finally, our wrap-up slide. This is just a quick summary of what your yes vote would mean or what your no vote would mean. So your yes vote would loosen those restrictions, and then a no vote would mean things stay as they are. Jenny, any questions?
Nope, I don't see any questions on that one.
Okay, excellent. Well, let's just move forward then. Thank you all.
Moving right along, we've got Prop 17. This restores the right to vote to persons on parole after completion of their prison term. Go ahead. The current situation is that California law prohibits people that are serving a prison term or that are on parole from voting. People in jail or on probation are still able to vote. And after a person completes their parole, their right to vote is automatically restored. So I'd like to pause for just a second and talk about parole versus probation. That's a question we get a lot. So all persons that have served a state prison sentence are on parole for generally 3 years after release from prison. Parole is a supervised program in which people must meet certain conditions that can include living only in certain places, being subject to searches, maybe completing a rehabilitative program, many more. There's possibilities for many more conditions on parole. Probation, on the other hand, is a different program that's imposed as an alternative to serving time in county jail or state prison. So currently there are approximately 50,000 people on parole in California. What Prop 17 would do, if passed, go ahead, is it would amend the California Constitution to allow people on parole to vote as long as they are otherwise eligible. So because all registered voters may also run for office, people on parole would technically be able to run for office if otherwise eligible. Of course, depending on the office and the requirements, involvement in the criminal justice system might prevent someone from running, for example, if they were convicted of perjury or bribery. Go ahead. Passage of Prop 17 would increase ongoing county costs because the county election officials obviously would need to register voters and send them materials each year. But how many people actually register would determine how much of the cost actually ended up being. In addition, there would be a one-time cost for the state to update their voter registration system, likely costing in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is less than 1% of the state's general fund budget currently. And I just want to give you a little context because I was curious. So it's kind of the policy of the Legislative Analyst Office, which is the one that we get a lot of our fiscal information from. If an amount is less than 1% of the state's general fund, then they just say it's less than 1% of the state's general fund. But they use the term hundreds of thousands of dollars so often that I actually calculated it myself. And that's actually 0.00059% of the general fund budget. So very significantly under the 1%. I just wanted to give you that context for when you hear those words from us going through these slides. Go ahead. Okay, so supporters say that nearly 50,000 Californians who've completed their prison sentence and pay taxes are not able to vote at any level of government, and that when a person completes their prison sentence, they should be encouraged to re-enter society and to have a stake in their community. A Florida study found that people who have completed their prison sentences and had their voting rights restored were less likely to commit crimes in the future. And then I'll note here that the League of Women Voters of California is an official signer of the argument in support for this proposition. Go ahead. Opponents say that Prop 17 would allow criminals convicted of violent crimes to vote before completing their sentence, including parole, that people convicted of non-violent felonies are incarcerated in county jails and already have the right to vote while serving their sentence, and that parole is to prove rehabilitation before full liberty, including voting rights, is restored. And if the state doesn't trust them with choosing where to live and travel to, et cetera, then they must not trust them with decisions that would impact the lives and finances of others. Go ahead. So to recap, a yes on Prop 17 would allow people that are on parole after they have completed their prison sentence to register to vote and vote if they choose. And then a no vote means nothing would change. People on parole would still be unable to vote.
So Prop 18 allows 17-year-olds to vote in an entire election cycle. So that's basically what you need to think about when you think about Prop 17. So next slide. Currently, 17-year-olds can pre-register to vote in California, but they're not eligible to cast a ballot until they're 18. So what that ends up doing is it disenfranchises some voters who turn 18 before the general election who did not get a chance to actually cast a ballot in the primary. So what this proposition would do is allow those individuals to actually vote in the whole election cycle, which includes the primary or any special elections. So what Prop 18 would do, as I said, would permit these 17-year-olds in the special category to vote in an entire cycle that includes that particular election. This is a very simple one, and it was very simply worded. I know some of these are pretty complex, and we'll get to some very complicated ones going forward, but as a simple proposition, this is very straightforward. And then the fiscal bottom line is the next slide. So there are a couple of on here that relate to voting, and the costs associated with those have to do with the process of voting and the costs surrounding voting. So voting materials and staff time, voter rolls updating, that type of thing. So at the end, you'll see the last bullet point, a percentage of the state's general fund. As Jenny said, you know, these percentages are pretty low, but again, we want to share the costs associated with these propositions. So supporters and their arguments, you know, mainly the idea behind this, in addition to allowing those 17-year-olds to complete an entire election cycle, not just show up at the end in the general, the idea behind this is allowing them to vote earlier would promote in them the idea of voter participation and civic duty, and instill in them perhaps a voting habit earlier in their lives. As you all know, a lot of times 18-year-olds are moving away to college and their lives are in upheaval, but a 17-year-old who is probably usually still in high school might have a support structure that can help him or her cast a ballot. And here are some of the supporters you'll see listed. And then there's the total money raised in support of this particular proposition. Of course, it has opponents as well. Some people believe that 17-year-olds aren't mature enough to make decisions on their ballot. They believe that they're more easily influenced and persuaded by the adults in their lives and perhaps even their peers. And so for these reasons, they oppose this particular proposition. And then you can see also the list of opponents there. On this particular one, you'll see we don't have data on funds raised in opposition. That doesn't mean money hasn't been raised in opposition to this, and you'll see on subsequent slides as well. We don't have data. It doesn't mean that it's not out there. It just means we didn't have it as of the date of the preparation of this particular slide deck. So next slide is just the general wrap up, what your yes vote means, what your no vote means. Again, very simple. Yes vote means that young adults turning 18 by the time of the general election would be able to vote in that entire election cycle, which would include the primary of that election and any special elections associated with that cycle. And a no vote means that it would just stay as it is. The law would continue on as it is, only allowing 18-year-olds to cast ballots. So very simple. Were there any questions on this one, Jenny?
I don't see any questions.
All right, excellent.
Okay. So that one was pretty straightforward, which is great because now I'm going to do Prop 20, which is not as straightforward. We're going to talk a little bit more about this one. Prop 20 would implement stricter parole measures for nonviolent crimes, and it would make certain offenses that are currently treated as misdemeanors into felonies. Go ahead. So a little background in criminal law that will hopefully be worth listening to. A felony is the most severe type of crime. State law defines some felonies as violent and serious or both. Examples of felonies defined as violent and serious include murder, robbery, and rape. Felonies that are not defined as violent or serious include human trafficking and selling drugs. A misdemeanor is a less serious crime. Misdemeanors include crimes such as assault and public drunkenness, and a person can possibly serve up to 1 year in county jail for some misdemeanors. People convicted of felonies used to always be sentenced to state prisons. However, in 2011, the Supreme Court of the United States held that California's overcrowded prisons were a violation of the Eighth Amendment, which bars cruel and unusual punishment. So since then, California has passed 3 measures that were intended to reduce that state prison population, both because of the court ruling, but also because sentiment seems to have changed about how many people society should incarcerate. So with that background, I'm gonna go through the 3 measures that court ruling sparked to give us a good baseline for the discussion on this proposition. First was AB 109, that's the California Public Safety Realignment Act, and it was passed by the legislature in 2011. This act called for some persons convicted of nonviolent, non-serious, non-sex offender crimes to be sentenced to county jail instead of state prison. This significantly reduced the prison populations, but not enough to meet the court mandated levels. So then Prop 47 was passed by voters in 2014, and that resulted in certain theft-related crimes being punished as misdemeanors instead of felonies, or as what are called wobblers. So wobblers are crimes that can be charged as either a misdemeanor or a felony, depending upon past criminal activity and other factors. Then in 2016, Prop 57 was passed by voters, and that allows for consideration of parole for those who are convicted of nonviolent crimes after the person serves the full term of the primary offense that they've been convicted for, but before they start serving any added on terms. This is sometimes called early release or early parole. So these 3 measures together have brought the total state prison population below 137% of capacity as ordered by the Supreme Court. But many individual prisons in California still do operate above that percentage. Go ahead. So what would Prop 20 do if it passed? Prop 20 would have 5 main effects. 1, it would create more wobbler crimes, those ones that can be charged as a felony or misdemeanor. And those would include certain theft and fraud offenses that had been made misdemeanors by Prop 47. And then 2 new categories of crime, serial crime and organized retail crime. 2, it would broaden the requirement to collect DNA from people convicted of a variety of crimes, including some crimes that were redefined as misdemeanors by Prop 47. 3, it would create additional requirements for the Board of Parole hearings to use when they're considering whether to grant parole to persons convicted of nonviolent crimes under the provisions of Prop 57. The prosecutors would be allowed to review information about the person and also to review the board's decision. And then it would also require that parole board to search for any victims that aren't already registered with the state so that those victims or families could submit letters regarding the potential parole. 4, it would add 51 crimes to the list of crimes classified as violent in order to exclude people convicted of those crimes for potential early parole consideration under Prop 57. And 5, it would require that county probation officers request that the person's parole or probation terms be revoked if a person has violated those terms 3 times, and that could ultimately result in harsher terms or placement in county jail. Go ahead. So the exact cost, or excuse me, the exact size of fiscal effects is dependent upon several factors. One key factor would be the decisions that were made by the courts, the county probation departments, and the prosecutors about how this proposition would be implemented. If all the provisions are fully implemented, estimates are that state and local correctional costs would increase because county jail populations would increase, the number of people released from prison would be reduced, and the process just in general would cost more. State and local court costs would increase due to increased workload, and state and local law enforcement costs would increase due to the expanded DNA collection. Go ahead. So supporters say that Prop 20 reclassifies certain crimes like assault with a deadly weapon, date rape, and child abuse as violent crimes. Prop 20 would not increase the prison population. It would make sure that people serve their entire sentence, and Prop 20 would help stop car break-ins, shoplifting, and other thefts that have been on the rise. Go ahead. And then opponents say that Prop 20 will roll back prison reforms and cost taxpayers millions of dollars annually. It slashes mental health and rehabilitation programs that help to prepare people for release and reduce repeat offenses. It will result in extreme sentences for petty theft and will disproportionately impact vulnerable minorities. And also that California prison reforms are working. The number of incarcerated adults is decreasing, and California property and violent crime rates are at historic lows. Go ahead. So to wrap up, a yes on Prop 20 means that there would be some rollback of the Proposition 47 and 57 provisions. I won't go through all of the things we just said, but certain crimes would increase penalties, and then there would be additional factors to consider when releasing certain inmates on parole. A no vote means everything would stay the same, and the law would continue on as it is now.
Okay, we'll go to Prop 25. So this is a referendum on a law from last year, SB 10, that you guys may remember, to eliminate money bail. So next slide. So as you may remember, there was in 2018, I guess, not 2019, sorry, the legislature passed SB 10, which eliminated money bail. So the people who were arrested or arraigned in court wouldn't have to post bail. So currently, the Constitution guarantees, excuse me, the right to bail when a person is arrested for a crime or arraigned in court, except in these instances: a death penalty case, a felony for violence on another person, a threat of violence against another person, or a felony sexual assault on another person. So SB 10 did not go into effect because of this referendum, which was filed. And you can see on the bullet point 1 on this particular slide that this referendum was funded by Californians against the reckless bail scheme. So next slide. So what would this prop do? So it would eliminate the current money bail system, and it would replace it with a system based on risk assessment. So a little bit about the risk assessment that we're referencing here. The risk assessment would consider things like the seriousness of the crime, people who perhaps in the defendant's life who are living with him or their brushes with the criminal justice system, and other details about the person who is being arraigned. It would also have high risk and medium risk people would not be released, so they would remain in jail. And I guess perhaps significantly what Prop 25 will do, because it's a referendum on SB 10, it would allow SB 10 legislation to go into effect. So the fiscal bottom line, here are some bullet points about associated or estimated costs. They could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually. They could possibly reduce jail costs if fewer people are being held in jail. The actual size of these effects is uncertain, though, as is many of these particular propositions, because we just have to wait and see how they're implemented. So some supporters and their arguments. So this has been around for a while. As I said, in 2018, this discussion about bail had come up, and part of it's because the current system, which allows people to post bail, favors people who are wealthy, and it makes sure that people who don't have means or have difficulty in their lives somehow financially don't have the same opportunities as rich people to get out of jail. And oftentimes if people stay in jail for a longer amount of time, it affects their ability to keep a job, which affects their ability to pay rent and keep their families intact. So these are some of the arguments in support of this, of eliminating the bail system. And you can see here some of the supporters of this particular proposition and the money raised. So it's the supporters are A New Way of Life, Anti-Recidivism Coalition, the California Federation of Teachers, and the California Democratic Party, and they've raised $8.3 million in support of this proposition. So I'll just quickly go through the opponents' arguments. So the opponents say the intentions of SB 10 are good, but they are concerned about the provisions of how it's going to actually be implemented. So part of that opposition comes from the possibility that the risk assessment tool that I referenced earlier will not be fair or unbiased. So essentially that risk assessment perhaps will be an algorithm that is fed into a lot of different opportunities to assess a defendant on their ability to either be safe in their community or to appear at their arraignment. So some of the opposition says that that tool might not be, there's no guarantee that it's going to be unbiased. And so they're concerned about the actual implementation of Prop 25. Some of the opponents, apparently there are about 120 organizations. A lot of them are bail bonds organizations. So Aladdin Bail Bonds with like $2,000, California Bail Agents Association, the California Black Chamber of Commerce is also one of the opponents as well. So, and they have raised and spent about $5 million to oppose this proposition. So finally, just to wrap up on Prop 25. So a yes vote on Prop 25, since this is a referendum, and means that no one would pay bail to be released from jail before trial, and instead people would either be released automatically or based on their assessed risk of committing another crime or not appearing in court. Or a no vote means that some people would continue to pay bail to be released from jail before trial, and fees may continue to be charged as a condition of release.
Just went through it all, but maybe just to recap, Prop 25 is if you vote yes on Prop 25, it's going to implement SB 10, and SB 10 would remove the cash bail system, meaning that somebody could not be retained in jail because they couldn't afford to get themselves out of jail while they're awaiting trial. Instead, the courts would just look at whether a person is a flight risk. They would use different factors to determine that, instead of now where a lot of times whether you stay in jail or not is determined by whether you can pay that bail. So I don't know if that's helpful for, it seems like there's a little bit of confusion, but there's a confusing proposition for sure.
Yeah, well, in particular that one, because like I said, it is a referendum and it does relate to SB 10, so that one is a bit more confusing.
And we would encourage you to look at other materials as well. You know, we'll share a lot of great resources with you at the end of the presentation, and then of course your voter information materials to really sit and kind of get into some of these propositions. They are very complicated. This year I have to say, they're pretty complicated. So y'all are hanging in there and doing great.
So, okay, that finishes up our cluster for criminal justice. And we're ready to move on to the miscellaneous issues that we alluded to earlier. So Jenny, we'll move forward with you.
All right. Miscellaneous issues. These are going to include Props 14, 22, 23, and 24. So getting started with Prop 14, this authorizes bonds to continue stem cell research in California. Go ahead. And before we get started on Prop 14 specifically, let's talk just for a minute about what a bond is. There's only one proposed bond in these state propositions, but they are often on the ballot in California. A bond is a form of a long-term borrowing that the state uses to raise funds for various projects. You can think of it as similar to a loan that one of us might get to accomplish something like remodeling your house. The state sells these bonds to investors, uses the money that the investors pays to the state for designated projects, and then pays the investor the money back with interest over a period of time. That period of time can vary, and for Prop 14, the money would be paid back over 30 years. Generally, bonds should be used for something long-term. You want to look at what the bond is paying for and think about whether that's a wise use of money. A principle behind using bonds is also that people that will benefit in the future from that project would also be contributing to the cost of it, 10 or 15 years down the road. So it wouldn't just be the people today paying for something that would last for a long time. So who pays the money back with interest to the investors? Well, in the case of Prop 14, the payback is going to come from the state's general fund. And so this is called a general obligation bond. This is the most significant type of bond that California issues, and they're pretty attractive to investors because payback is essentially guaranteed. Money for the general fund primarily comes from income and sales tax revenue. So the answer to who is paying the money back is essentially all of us. Go ahead. So in 2004, voters approved Proposition 71, which added a provision to the California Constitution allowing stem cell research. The measure also created the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, or CIRM, and allowed the state to sell $3 billion in bonds to fund CIRM grants and operations. Most of that $3 billion has been used up. There's only about $30 million remaining, so they're looking for some more money. The projects that were funded by CIRM grants include stem cell research, the development of potential treatments for many diseases, clinical trials for new potential treatments, construction of new research facilities, and funding of internships for research students. Grant recipients who make a profit from licensing or selling inventions created with this funding are required to share a portion of the income from those inventions with the state. Go ahead. So Prop 14, if passed, would allow the state to sell another $5.5 billion in new bonds to continue the CIRM's funding of stem cell therapies, research, training, and delivery of treatment to patients. Prop 14 also sets new limits on how those bond funds can be used. $1.5 billion is set aside specifically for research and development of treatments for diseases affecting the brain and central nervous system, and those include Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, among others. In addition, the administrative costs are limited to 7.5% of the bond funds. Prop 14 would also make several changes to the CIRM and its governing board, and these changes are intended to expand patient access to the stem cell treatments. Go ahead. The fiscal effects on this are that the total state costs are estimated to be at $7.8 billion over a 30-year period. So that includes the $5.5 billion in principal and the $2.3 billion in interest to repay the investors who purchased the bonds. If you take a look at this slide, you'll see a graphic that represents the percentage of the state's general fund that's used to pay for bonds. The yellow is the bonds that have already been sold and that are currently being repaid. The turquoise is bonds that voters have authorized, but sometimes the state doesn't sell them right away, so the state hasn't sold that turquoise portion of bonds yet. And then the red represents the amount that the debt service would increase if Prop 14 does pass. Prop 14 would add about $260 million in payments to investors each year for the next 30 years. Some of those costs could be offset by the requirement for grant recipients to share profits, but today the state has only recouped $350,000 from that provision, so it's likely that that wouldn't amount to much. So supporters say that nearly half of all California families include someone who could benefit from stem cell research, that the original stem cell funding has led to significant treatments and cures, and that new revenues, economic activity, and jobs generated would contribute to California's economic recovery. It would only cost an average of less than $5 per person annually. And then opponents say that it wastes billions in the middle of an economic crisis It funds a bureaucracy with serious problems, and some have questioned the integrity and independence of the state agency that oversees the funds. Others can do this job better, for example, the National Institute of Health or private investors, and that Prop 14 means higher taxes or layoffs or both, because paying back the costs would mean a huge tax increase, or laying off thousands of nurses and other heroes who do the real work of keeping California healthy. Go ahead. So to wrap up, a yes vote means that the state would sell $5.5 billion in general obligation bonds for stem cell research, and a no vote means the state would not, and CIRM would have to find funding elsewhere. You have any questions on that one?
Thanks, Jenny. No questions on that particular one, but stay on with me for a second because there was a Facebook question regarding the proposition that I covered just prior to this regarding money bail, and the question regarded the assessment. So my understanding is that the risk assessment tool would work, and it would be like an algorithm perhaps designed by data scientists to work in conjunction with local judges to assess the defendant's flight risk and or risk to society. Is that your understanding regarding the proposition of money bail?
Yeah, that's my understanding as well, that the risk assessment tools are based on research about probabilities. So, you know, the characteristics of a particular person would be taken into account, and then those characteristics are assigned a point value, and then those point values are totaled to come up with whether the person is considered low, medium, or high risk. So sometimes there's questions about the accuracy of those assessment tools as well, because always there's going to be some kind of value judgments made whenever you're looking at characteristics, whether it's by a judge or a risk assessment tool or anyone else, right?
Exactly. Thank you. And so just a little breather here. I just want to say, like, in addition to the technical problems we've had here that you've all been able to witness, I personally have had not one, but two lights go out in my home, and my earbuds batteries died. So I really appreciate all of you for sticking with us and, you know, supporting us on this and getting this done with us. So it's really important information.
I did suggest that people could bring a mimosa to this.
Maybe I should have had a mimosa before we got started. Seriously, man, I've never been in a presentation where I had so many technical difficulties. So anyway, let's just power through and we'll talk about the next proposition. It's 22. You all probably are very familiar with the ideas behind Prop 22 because you might remember ACA 5. So Prop 22 exempts app-based transportation and delivery companies from providing employee benefits. So next slide. You all may remember that the Assembly Bill AB 5 passed in 2019, and it required that rideshare companies like Lyft and Uber categorize their employees, their workers as employees. So prior to that, they were independent contractors, which meant that they had different latitude, but they also were not allowed employee benefits that come with the status of employment. So after AB 5 passed, the rideshare companies refused to implement it and they brought suit. So that's why we're here today talking about this particular proposition. So next slide. So what Prop 22 would do is it would classify drivers for these particular companies, those rideshare companies, as independent contractors, not employees. So it would undo that aspect of what AB 5 did. And so as a result, these drivers would not receive employee benefits, as I mentioned. That includes minimum wage, overtime, unemployment insurance, or workers' comp. So those are all benefits that you get as a categorized employee, which would not be required of these app-based companies to provide their independent contractors, their workers. But it would also prohibit drivers from working more than 12 hours on a 24-hour shift, and it would require pay of at least 120% of minimum wage. So it had those benefits built into Prop 22, as it also rolled back the provisions for protections that employees get. So next slide. So the bottom line, again, we just try to find estimates on where what would this implementation of this proposition would bring. So it's estimated that the lower costs and the higher profits of these rideshare companies that would be gained by this particular proposition would be implemented and used to lower the prices that customers would have to pay to take rides, etc. It's estimated that a minor increase in state income taxes would be paid, and then increase in company profits for these companies might affect their stock prices in a positive way. Next slide. So here are the supporters' arguments. So the first bullet point here is particularly telling, I think. So 80% of the app-based drivers, so the people who are mostly affected by this particular bill, are the ones who are supporting it. And so some of their reasons they say is they like the flexibility of being an independent contractor versus the restrictions that perhaps being an employee would bring. And the supporters say that AB 5 will result in the loss of jobs, longer wait times, and significantly higher customer prices. So rolling back AB 5 is a benefit in these ways. So here are some of the supporters. You can read a couple of the other supporters' arguments there. Creating expanded public safety protection, so it would include background checks, etc. And then the supporters are, as you might imagine, the app-based companies, like we just mentioned, DoorDash, Lyft, and Uber, the ones who brought suit against AB 5, and then some other organizations as well. And then look at the amount of money that's been raised to support this particular proposition. $182 billion, so million. Now let's go to the next slide. We'll look at some of the opponents of this and their arguments. So the argument against it is that it eliminates workplace benefits and replaces them with lower payments that are only designed to benefit the company and not the people. Another argument in opposition is that these app-based drivers are full-time with 70% working 30 hours a week or more, and they deserve to be treated as employees. And then you can see there are 150 organizations in opposition to this proposition, and they include the ones that you see listed here. And then there's the amount of money that's been raised in opposition to this particular proposition. So last slide wrap up. Your yes vote, it just means that app-based rideshare and delivery companies can categorize their people as independent contractors. And a no vote means that the app-based rideshare and delivery companies would have to hire drivers as employees if that court decision, which is still pending, worked out in their favor.
We have one question. I'm not sure if we're able to answer that one, but it's saying that the companies are already required to do background checks. So why is it mentioned in a provision?
Well, it is interesting that there are some propositions, like when we get to the kidney dialysis one, you'll see that there are requirements built into that proposition that are already actually implemented now, but they're just included because that's just part of the proposition and some of the requirements that it is implementing, even if they're already implemented now. So that occasionally happens in propositions like this, and you'll see it later in the kidney one.
And I would imagine sometimes those details, if you dive into the measures, you know, all the fine details, there might be a few discrepancies between what exists and what would change.
And how it's implemented and worded, et cetera. All right, was that it on 22?
That's it.
Excellent, let's move forward to 23.
Okay. Proposition 23 establishes state requirements for kidney dialysis clinics regarding on-site medical professionals. So a little background on this proposition. This one also may look familiar. There's a lot of repeats this election season, as there was a proposition on the November 2018 ballot that also dealt with dialysis clinics. And that proposition, also supported by the same union, reflected a conflict between the union and the state's two largest dialysis businesses, DaVita Inc. and Fresenius Medical Care. So knowing a little bit about dialysis treatments is helpful with this one. Patients with end-stage renal disease have kidneys that don't function well, and to survive, the person must either get a kidney transplant or have ongoing dialysis treatments. Treatment generally takes about 4 hours, and it happens 3 times a week. The lives of patients on dialysis can be extended for years with this treatment. Roughly 80,000 Californians receive treatment at the 588 chronic dialysis clinics across the state. And DaVita and Fresenius own and operate around 72% of those clinics, earning about $3 billion annually. Currently, the California Department of Health licenses and certifies dialysis clinics in California, and for the most part, California relies on federal regulations as the basis for its licensing program. Those federal regulations require that each patient be visited by their physician at the clinic at least one time per month, and each clinic must employ a medical director who is a board-certified physician, a position that's estimated to be about 1/4 time, which implies that one physician could rotate around as a medical director among several different clinics. So that's where we are today with the current law. Go ahead. If passed, Prop 23 would require 4 things from dialysis clinics. First, there must be a licensed physician on site during all hours of operation, unless there's a shortage of physicians, and then they could have a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant on site. 2, the clinics must report dialysis-related infection data to state and federal governments. I think that's an example of what Lori mentioned before. There is requirements to do that now. These are likely different in some way. 3rd, clinics must get approval from the state to close or reduce services. And 4th, clinics may not discriminate against patients based on the source of payment for their care. And the background on that is that most patient treatment is paid for by Medicare or Medi-Cal, but those payments generally are much lower than payments that the clinics receive from private insurance. So there could be no discrimination based upon that. Go ahead. The fiscal effects of this would include increased costs for the dialysis clinics by several $100,000 each year, and those clinics could respond to the increased costs by spreading the costs across multiple clinics, negotiating increased rates with the insurance payers, continuing current operations but with lower profits, or even closing some clinics. Or it could be a combination of all of those strategies. Because so much of dialysis treatment is paid for by Medi-Cal and Medicare, passage of Prop 23 would likely increase healthcare costs for state and local governments by the low tens of millions of dollars annually. That would be because dialysis companies would negotiate higher payment rates, and also possibly because more patients would require treatment in a more costly hospital setting if some of these clinics close. The cost just mentioned represents a minor increase in the state's total spending on Medi-Cal and less than 1% of the state's general fund spending. Go ahead. Supporters argue that dialysis is a dangerous procedure, and if something goes wrong, a doctor or highly trained nurse should be nearby, that dialysis patients are prone to infections from their treatments that can lead to serious illness or death, and proper reporting and transparency of those rates would encourage clinics to improve their quality. Also, strong protections should be provided to vulnerable patients when clinics close. Go ahead. Opponents argue that the increased cost of requiring on-site physicians at every clinic would force the clinics to cut services and possibly close, that full-time on-site physicians aren't necessary because dialysis patients are already under the care of their personal kidney physician, and specially trained personnel administer all dialysis treatments. Prop 23 could make our physician shortage worse and lead to more emergency room overcrowding, and dialysis clinics are already strictly regulated and provide high quality care. So the wrap up on this one is just a yes vote, means that chronic dialysis clinics would be required to have a doctor on site during all patient treatment hours, and a no vote means they would not be required to have a doctor on site at all hours. It would stay the same as it is now. Any questions on that one? Uh-oh, have we lost?
No, I'm sorry. I was literally just typing an answer. No broad hue and cry for any particular information on that. There was just a simple little Q&A that I answered on the screen. So you guys check your Q&A, you'll see some answers on there. Great. So thank you, Jenny. You might want to stay on for this one because this one is one of the most complex laws. What we're going to do today is give you all kind of an overview about Prop 24, but it's one of the longest pieces of legislation that was submitted for this election cycle. So let's go ahead and get started on 24. This amends the Consumer Privacy Act. So currently, as you all may remember, in 2018, so you've probably noticed by now, a lot of these propositions actually allude to and reference previous recent legislation that we just reviewed and signed into law in the last few years, or in like the case of SB 10, didn't sign into law. So a lot of these that we're looking at today should be very, very familiar to you all, because it's the content is essentially what we've reviewed in previous years, like that kidney dialysis one. This is a situation that's very similar. So in 2018, you all may remember we voted in the California Consumer Privacy Act. And so that allowed us to know about the personal information that businesses collect on us online. And it allows us also to delete personal information that they collect. It allows us to opt out of the sale. You guys probably noticed that after this passed, you probably noticed when you went to a new website, a little pop-up would come up on your browser that asked you to check out cookies and allow privacy settings. So it also allows for non-discrimination of exercising your rights. So if you don't allow those settings to occur and you enforce your privacy settings, the current situation requires that you can't be discriminated against by making that choice. So next slide. So Prop 24 would amend and expand the 2018 California Privacy Act. And it would do this by establishing a new California Privacy Protection Agency to replace the California Department of Justice. So currently the California Department of Justice administers the 2018 CPA. This would establish a new agency to do that oversight. It would permit consumers to prevent businesses from sharing their personal information, correct inaccurate information, and limit businesses' use of sensitive personal information. So it just expands the rights that we voted in, just like I said, in 2018. It would also increase the penalties, the financial penalties that companies would be fined, the fines that would be required for companies that violate these privacy protection laws. So that's another one of the items that expands the previous proposition or the law. Okay, next slide. So fiscal bottom line, again, estimations regarding how this is going to be implemented and what the outcome is going to be. So increases state costs of at least $10 million annually for the implementation and creation of that new agency that I referenced in the previous slide. It would also increase costs for court and Department of Justice enforcement workload. Some of these costs would be paid by penalties collected. As I mentioned, the penalties, the fees and fines would be increased. And so those would help pay for some of these costs associated with implementing this proposition. But there's also an unknown impact on the state and local tax revenues due to the economic results. So, there's always an unknown in some of these. Next slide. So here are some of the supporters' arguments. So again, the supporters believe that we need expanded rights in this area and that consumers need more protection, and this would provide that for them. It also discusses strengthening those protections with this $10 million a year new agency. And by virtue of being a ballot initiative, it's less vulnerable to watering down through legislation or the legislators. Here are some of the supporters and the money raised to support this particular prop. Next slide. And then the opponent's argument. So here are some of the opponents of this particular proposition. The money raised and their arguments, just the main one they say is it puts the burden on consumers to opt out. So it's supposedly more work for consumers to help implement these laws, and putting the onus of this implementation on the consumer versus on the company is one of the arguments against it. It would also allow employers to keep gathering data about things like employees' pregnancies, religion, or political activism. That's another one of the arguments. And so just to wrap up, what your yes vote would look like and mean, next slide. A yes vote means that the privacy laws would be expanded by this proposition, and the significant and particular increases and expansions that I mentioned would go into place. A no vote means that we would just keep the agency that we voted in 2018, and those data privacy laws would stay in effect. So, Jenny, were there any questions on this one?
There are not any questions on this one. And Lori,
Wow.
I want to congratulate you. We have made it through all 12 of the state propositions.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, well, and you would think that we're done, but we're not. There's more.
There's more.
So anybody who is going to be voting in the city of San Diego, you can stay. We'll review the San Diego measures. It's measures A through E, as you can see here, and these are a lot simpler than the ones we've just reviewed. So if you, again, like I said, if you're going to be voting in San Diego, stick around, and we'll do a really quick run through on these as well. So let's get started. We'll start with Measure A. We did not categorize these. There's only 5 of them, and 2 of them that are sequential are related. So it just worked out nicely that we're just going to review these in the order that you see them here. So Jenny, you want to get started with Measure A?
Sure. And I just want to give a shout out in case you're hopping off the call, you need to go, that lwvsandiego.org. That's our website. We have all sorts of voting resources, information on your ballot at state and local level, as well as just about anything you need to know about the actual election itself. So make sure to head there.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Jenny.
Sure. Okay, so San Diego City measures. Measure A. This is a proposition that would allow the issuance of affordable housing bonds. So Measure A, just to also say that this bond is similar to what we talked about with Prop 14 in that it is a bond, but it's a city bond as opposed to a state bond. And in addition, this bond must receive a 2/3 majority to pass. 66% of voters must say yes. So currently, according to a May 2020 report by the San Diego Housing Commission, approximately 165,000 households in San Diego are classified as low, very low, or extremely low income. And that means that the household makes 80% or less of the area median income, which in San Diego for a family of 4 is $92,000 annually. 85% of the extremely low income households and 48% of the very low income households are paying more than 50% of their income for housing in San Diego. And the report further states that the gap is growing as the supply of naturally occurring affordable housing continues to shrink. Go ahead. So if passed, Measure A would increase property taxes on all real property in the city of San Diego to secure up to $900 million in bonds that would be issued by the city. Those bond proceeds would be used to acquire and improve real property to provide permanent supportive housing and affordable housing for vulnerable populations. That's defined as those with extremely low and low income, those at risk of being houseless, and people that are suffering from mental health or substance abuse illnesses. The bond proceeds would be able to be leveraged to attract private and public matching funds, including from state and federal sources. And without the passage of this bond, there wouldn't be a source of revenue to apply for much of those matching funds. If the measure does pass, the City Council would also introduce an ordinance relating to housing impact fees on commercial developments, which would allow property owners subject to that fee to get a credit or reimbursement for any such fees or costs paid. The fiscal bottom line on this is that the cost of the bonds over the next 46 years are estimated to be $2.1 billion. If the credit for certain developers and owners of real property that I just mentioned was passed by the City Council, so that credit would be for if someone has paid a fee to support affordable housing or if they've constructed affordable housing. So if the City Council approved a credit for that, it would indeed reduce the other funds available for affordable housing in an amount that we don't know what that would be yet. So go forward one more. Okay, so the actual property tax effects on this, and remember this affects all properties, not just residential. To drill a little deeper here, if you assume a $150 million taxable bond is first issued in 2022, then the annual tax increase to property owners is estimated to be $3.14 per $100,000 of assessed property value. So on a $679,000 home, which is what we're being told is the median price right now on homes in San Diego, that would mean a total increase of $21.33 for that first year. If an additional $125 million in bonds were issued each year for the next 6 years, that would reach the maximum authorized bond issuance of $900 million. And at that point, when all of the bonds are issued, the total annual tax increase for property owners in that 6th year is expected to be $20.85 per $100,000 of assessed value. Or for that $679,000 property, the total amount paid per year would be $141.54. Go ahead. So supporters say that this would allow San Diego to provide a long-term policy to address homelessness and provide affordable homes, so hardworking San Diego families could stay in San Diego. It would generate local funds needed to match the millions in federal and state matching funds that San Diego currently cannot access. It would create safe, clean, and healthy homes for low-income seniors, veterans, and those with mental health and physical-related disabilities, and it would provide affordable homes near jobs for low-income families. Go ahead. Opponents say in just the first 5 years under Measure A, the average homeowner would see their property tax increase by $500 or more, and that taxpayers would be on the hook to pay this increase for more than 40 years. San Diego already has the highest property tax rate in the county, and too many working families are struggling with that. Measure A fails to protect taxpayers by refusing to ban controversial project labor agreements that discriminate against non-union firms. And recent studies have shown that the projects that would be funded by Measure A have been riddled by wasteful spending and financial mismanagement. I just wanted to note on this one, because the opponent mentions it, that Measure A doesn't have any mention of project labor agreements in it. So obviously that's a controversial issue. Whether the city decides to support those or ban them, that's a whole nother topic, but I just wanted to be clear that there isn't anything in this measure that talks about project labor agreements. Go ahead. So then to wrap up, a yes on Measure A means that the city of San Diego would authorize the issuance and sale of $900 million of general obligation bonds, and those would be secured by new taxes on real property located within the city of San Diego to provide affordable housing. And a no means that we wouldn't be able to sell those bonds, and those funds would not be available. Any
Great.
questions?
Well, there weren't any questions until just the second. So I'll just ask these live, Jenny. Can you clarify the discrepancy in the annual property tax amount between the pro and con cases that you presented?
So if you go ahead and go back to the opposition, because I was a little bit confused about that one too. So I did some calculations, and I think, and I'm guessing for the opposition here, I don't want to speak for them, but what it looks like to me is if you did add up the maximum amount that your property taxes would be raised once all $900 million are sold, bonds are sold. If you added that up year after year, so that $141 increase, that yes, in 5 years you would pay over $500. But there doesn't seem to be a time when you would pay over $500 in 1 year because of this bond if your home were $679,000. So hopefully that clarifies.
Excellent. All right. There was just a general question about how these, how this legislation gets on our ballot. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, there are a couple of ways that these ballot measures come to our ballot. Same with the propositions. It can be a citizens initiative where a certain amount of signatures are required of registered voters. And if that number is hit, then that ballot or that legislation goes to the ballot, or it can come to our ballots via our city council members or the legislature in the case of the proposition. So that's how these measures get on. The propositions are generated and initiated by the state. And these measures that we're doing now, the 5 that we mentioned, or the ones that we're talking about now, they are the city measures. Okay, so let's move to Measure B. So Measure B, this establishes an independent commission on police practices, and you all may be very familiar with this. Again, this is not new. This is an idea that's been around for years and years and years, and it was introduced to the City Council by San Diegans for Justice, and the City Council voted to put this on your ballots. So next slide. So currently, we have a community review board on police practices. And it was established to address some of the issues that this measure was going to, as we go forward, I'll tell you, we'll address. But it doesn't have independent investigation authority, nor does it have subpoena power. So even though it was established ostensibly to look into some of these police practices that this current measure is addressing, because it doesn't have a lot of authority, it has been deemed ineffective by the proponents of this measure. And also, the Community Review Board has to refer its information to the city attorney, which, as you know, the city attorney is the attorney for the city under which the police department is covered. So there's also a Citizens Advisory Board on Police and Community Relations, and its purpose is to study and understand and recommend changes related to the police department. And it also has to refer to the city attorney. So you can all see that these interactions between these review boards and the city attorney have made some people think that perhaps it's not a great or a very well organized interaction. So board members for both of these groups are appointed by the mayor plus a majority vote on the city council. So I'm just setting all that up so I can discuss more thoroughly in the next slide what some of the changes are going to be and how they relate to what we currently have. So what Measure B would do is it would amend the city charter and dissolve that community review board that I mentioned earlier. And it would establish in its stead an independent commission on police practices. And this commission will be appointed by the city council rather than by the mayor, as the previous one was, as I mentioned. This new community review board or commission on this new commission on police practices would be able to investigate officer-involved shootings. It would have subpoena power. It would have the ability to hire independent experts outside of the city government, including the attorneys. And it would have a broader range of what types of investigations it wanted to conduct. So it would be much more independent than the current community review board. So next slide. The fiscal bottom line. So here are the estimations. So now currently we pay the boards that I mentioned previously around $250,000 for their work, and dissolving the CRB would roll that money back into our coffers, and then the net cost of establishing this new commission would be between $1 million and $2.5 million, say. And that funding, like I said, would come from the general fund. And then, as you can see, it's estimated that the necessary staffing would be about 1.2 million. So that's the fiscal bottom line for this particular measure. Next slide. And here are some of the supporters' arguments. So you probably understood from the difference in these two organizations what some of the arguments for and against are, but this independent commission will be able to hire outside experts, as I mentioned earlier, and it won't be dependent upon the city attorney or the mayor to make assignments and refer its recommendations. And the charter amendments will allow for the independent experts, as I mentioned earlier, to investigate claims of police misconduct. Here are some of the supporters. A little background, this original, as I mentioned, this has been around for several years. It was originally brought forward by Women Occupy San Diego several years ago. And they, in turn, ultimately ended up working with San Diegans for Justice to get this on your ballot. Okay, next slide. People who oppose this particular piece of legislation. So when we do our ballot analysis, we pull records from the city clerk and we use official information that's been filed with the city clerk. And at the time of this presentation's development, there were no city clerk papers filed in opposition to this particular measure. And so as a result, we have no information on any known formal opposition. So next slide. So if you vote yes on this, what will happen is it will dissolve the CRB and replace it with this new commission on police practices appointed by the city council with all the powers that I mentioned earlier regarding independent subpoena power and being able to hire and bring on independent experts. And a no vote means that things would remain the same. We'd continue to use the CRB for these particular issues. So Jenny, are there any questions?
Nope, there's no questions on this one.
Alrighty then, well, let's move forward to Measure C. Thanks.
Okay, great. So Measure C establishes district-only elections for members of the Board of Education of the San Diego Unified School District. Currently, the city charter, which governs San Diego Unified School District trustee elections, you can go forward on that, provides for district-only elections during primary elections and then at-large elections for the general election. What that means is that voters from a particular district can choose who they want to see in the move forward into the general election when they vote in the primary, but then voters from all the districts actually get to determine who will represent that one district. Go ahead. So on this map, you can see all 5 districts for the San Diego Unified School Board here. I just am a visualizing person, so I like to see it. Currently, if several candidates were running for, say, District A, in the primary, only voters in District A would get to vote on who moves forward to the general election. But then, moving over to graphic 2, in the general election, voters from all of these districts would actually vote on who would end up representing District A. Go ahead. What Measure C would do is it would replace language in the city charter with the result of providing a district-only process for electing school board members at the general election. So going back to our previous example, only voters in District A would ever get to vote on who would be the school board member for District A. And that would mirror how the city council members are elected in San Diego. That's how we do it when we choose those city council members. So go ahead. And then the fiscal effect on this is relatively small and would be a result of some election costs. Go ahead. It's pretty basic. Once you get the idea of at-large elections versus district-only elections, it's a pretty basic measure. So supporters say that at-large elections weaken the representation of small groups, especially people of color that don't have a citywide base, allowing special interests to elect their preferred candidates. Measure C would reduce the time that candidates have to spend on fundraising to remain competitive in a citywide race, and it allows them to focus on delivering solutions to parents, students, and their communities. The current election process doesn't result in a board reflecting the diversity of the district, but district-only elections assure voters fairer representation. Go ahead. And opponents say that the present system balances community needs and larger concerns by ensuring every board member cares about all of the kids in every neighborhood in San Diego Unified. District-only elections can be dominated by big money special interests who'd be able to elect board members who are beholden to them. Special interests want to privatize public education, and that's who are behind Measure C. And then the 5 districts are likely to be unbalanced with low-income neighborhoods grouped into 1 or 2 districts. Vote-rich areas would be able to elect a board majority and dominate school funding and other educational decisions. Just a note too, that this measure, as well as the next one that Lori will talk about, because it deals with San Diego Unified School Board elections, it would actually only be people that reside within the San Diego Unified School District that would see this on their ballot. So not everybody in the city of San Diego will have this on their ballot. Go ahead. To wrap up, yes means that the city charter would be amended to elect school board members by voters from their respective districts, and no means existing law remains and school board members would be elected at the general election through citywide elections.
All right, great job, Jenny. No questions on that so far. So that was an excellent review there. So we'll just move forward with the other measure that's related to that. As Jenny said, this one also, Measure D, references the San Diego Unified School District. And in this particular case, it provides protocol for filling vacancies, removing for cause, and succession plans for the members of the board of the school district. So next slide. So currently, The city charter includes election procedures when there is a vacancy on the school board, but it doesn't define what constitutes a vacancy nor provide for the removal of school board members. So I'm just going to back up a second and just remind everybody, the city of San Diego has a city charter, which is akin to the state of California's constitution. So as we were going through the propositions earlier, you know that we referenced propositional, propositions to amend the Constitution of California. Well, some of these are designed to amend the city charter. So I just wanted to draw that parallel. And so this is one of those. So next slide. So what Measure D would do is it would, as I said, amend the city charter to bring the members of the school board under the city laws that provide procedures to remove elected officials. So just like the city of San Diego, as Jenny was saying, the measure before this would realign the election of the SDSU, San Diego Unified School District Board, with the city council the way it's elected. And this would provide a similar alignment with the city laws. So school board members would be governed, as I said, by vacancy, removal, and succession laws similar to those already in place and already being used and instituted by our other city officials. So next slide. Well, here, there's no fiscal impact associated with these charter amendments in this particular measure. So nothing to consider there. Next slide. And here are some of the supporters and their arguments. So similar, I guess, to the previous supporters, this alignment is good governance, apparently, pulling together all these organizations under a coherent and cohesive city law umbrella. And it should protect the public from politicians who abuse their office by committing crimes. So establishing these protocols helps protect the public by making sure that the elected officials are where they're supposed to be and out of office if that's the requirement. And it reduces the need for costly and time-consuming recall if a board member refuses to resign. So you can see it has some of the advantages that currently the other city officials enjoy. Okay, next slide. So again, as I said, we pull our information for these slides from official documents, in this case, the city clerk, and there were no arguments in opposition to this and no opponents registered with the clerk. So nothing to report here. Next slide. So this is what your yes vote looks like. You vote yes on this. It aligns the city charter to make sure the Unified School District Board members are governed under existing laws. And a no vote means that it continues to operate as it does without that, without being under those laws. So, Jenny, anything in the Q&A for this particular one?
Nope, I think we're good on this one.
Excellent. Okay, we'll move to Measure E.
Okay, so I don't know if you can see it because of my virtual background, but in celebration of getting to our very last measure, I put my plumeria in, also in anticipation of talking about this measure, which deals with coastal zones. So see what I did there. Thanks everyone for hanging in with us. We are on our last measure, Measure E. This measure would allow an exemption to the height limit in the Midway District of San Diego. Go ahead. So in 1972, voters passed Prop D, creating a coastal zone height limit that applied to buildings in most of the coastal area between the Pacific Ocean and Interstate 5. Within that designated coastal zone, construction of buildings and structures were limited to a maximum of 30 feet in height. Since that time, many members of the Midway Pacific area feel that the height limit is hampering the efforts at redevelopment in that area. Go ahead. You can see here on this graphic, the area in, I guess, yellowy beige is the area that this measure is concerned with. If Measure E passes, that beigey area would be exempt from the height limit currently imposed by the coastal zone designation. Many of you are probably familiar with this area. It's mostly known as commercial, industrial, and a few strip clubs. There is a Midway Pacific community plan for the area that's looking to redevelop this section. Go ahead. So what would Measure E do? It would amend, the amendment would exclude the area on the map from the coastal height limit, but that height limit would still remain in effect throughout the remainder of the coastal areas of the city of San Diego. Within the updated 2018 community plan, there are specific height requirements defined as base heights that are within the municipal code that would still apply to this exempted area. So this measure would only eliminate that coastal height limit restriction. Currently, there are no new height limits proposed beyond those existing base heights that come from the municipal code, and those restrictions vary from parcel to parcel depending as to what those limits are. Go ahead. So there's no fiscal impact associated with this amendment. Go ahead. And supporters say that Prop D back in the 70s was intended to prevent Miami Beach type high rises being erected along the waterfront, and Midway is definitely not an ocean view corridor. Measure E is the catalyst to modernizing the 54-year-old sports arena and the key to creating a pedestrian-friendly, transit-oriented community with entertainment, shops, and outdoor recreation. And the Midway Community Planning Group unanimously supports removing the 30-foot height limit in Midway because it will bring to life the community's vision for a thriving cultural and economic hub. Go ahead. Opponents say that Measure E could be the first step towards San Diego lifting the height limit in the rest of the coastal zone, including La Jolla, Ocean Beach, Point Loma. The community plan for this project area describes about 1,300 acres total, of which 980 acres are public land and public right-of-ways. So this could be an opportunity for a vast green belt of parks, of sports fields, recreation areas, and a restored stretch of the San Diego River. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to convert 200 plus acres to parkland. And this scheme means worse freeway congestion, overloaded beach access roads, and no parking. Go ahead. To wrap up, Measure E, a yes vote means removal of the 30-foot height limit in the Midway Pacific Highway area, community plan area. And then a no vote means that 30-foot height limit would remain in effect for that area.
Excellent. Thanks, Jenny. No question. Oh, a question just popped in. I'll take a quick look. Actually, Jenny, why don't you take a look, and I will move forward on this next slide, and we can answer that either on the screen or live if you want to. But I wanted to go ahead. We've run a little bit over time here, and I wanted to tell you all, as promised, we are going to provide in the chat right now links to some of these voting resources. In particular, I want to call attention to our website. Please go on there. We have an entire tab page dedicated to voting resources where you will find all of the other links that you see here, including Voter's Edge. It'll be right at the top of our voting resources page, and that is your customized online voter guide. So you can actually go in there, you can pull up your own ballot, you can even create your own sample ballot. So as you go through these propositions and measures, you decide how you want to vote, you can create a little sample ballot for yourself so that when your official ballot arrives after October 15th, which is when they're going to be mailed, you can actually go back into Voter's Edge, pull up your sample ballot that you've created, and mark your official ballot and pop it in the mail or drop it on into any of those drop boxes we mentioned earlier. Again, the other items here, Easy Voter Guide, SD Vote, which is our Register Our Voters, and our League of Women Voters site are going to be in your chat right now. So let's advance the slide one more. And I want to invite you all, if you found this helpful and you want to share it, go to our YouTube channel. We're going to post that in the chat as well. But also please consider supporting the work that we do here. We are a nonprofit, all volunteer organization. This presentation you saw today took dozens of people to pull together. We had tech support, slide producers, research analysts, wordsmith editing, presenter trainings, etc. So it's a vast undertaking to provide a lot of this information. We also do candidate forums that we're going to be hosting, and many of you may have already seen some of these candidate forums. So go to our website, upcoming events, you'll be able to register for candidate forums, and you'll be able to see this particular recording on our YouTube channel. So Jenny, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say you did misspeak and say ballots go out by the 15th of October. All ballots will be mailed by October 5th.
Sorry.
5th. You should be looking in the mail because some of them have already been mailed. Make sure that you go to where'smyballot.sos.ca.gov. You can sign up for alerts. It'll tell you when your ballot's been mailed, when the ROV receives it. when it's counted and if there's any issues with it. So you'll know exactly where that ballot is, but you should be looking in the mail this week for those.
That's right. So we're coming down to the wire, you guys. It's October. We only have a few days left. I'm going to invite you also while you're on our website to sign up for 101 Days of Action. It's our daily activism post that will come straight to your inbox. You can find those also on our social media, where we give you actually independent items you can conduct every day to feel part of this democracy and help support the election. There are some of these activities are clicking on links, attending events, educating yourself on particular issues. Jenny is our curator for that, so kudos to her for the great work she's done on 101 Days of Action. So feel free to go to our website, look around, sign up for things. It's going to be an exciting time. Stay connected with us on all of our social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And thank you all so much for your participation and for being informed citizens, and go out there and vote. Get it done. All right.
Thank you, everyone. Go enjoy your day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.